a royal guard discovered the unthinkable. An innocent man had been jailed for 7 years. The guardsman came to my counter at 9:04 on a wet morning, and he did not ask for anything a guardsman is supposed to ask for. I remember the time because I was stamping the day's first writ, and the brass date wheel had jammed on the 4, and I was pressing it with my thumb when his shadow fell across the ledger. Red tunic, white gloves, wet at the fingertips, the bearskin under his left arm because a man does not wear it indoors in the registry of the Court of Assize, and because he had walked here in the rain from the Ashgrove precinct without an umbrella, like a man who had not thought about rain at all. He set a tin box on my counter. It was the size of a loaf. It had been painted green once, and the paint had blistered off in patches, and someone long ago had scratched a word into the lid with a nail. Found. Madam Registrar, he said, who witnessed Tobin Ferrow's mark. My name is Murrin Kell. I have kept the records of the Court of Assize for 11 years, and I had spent 7 of them not asking that question, and I want to be honest at the start of this, because the guardsman was honest and I was not, and the difference between us is the whole of what follows. I would need the case number, I said. 741 of the winter sitting, he said. The Ashgrove Chapel fire, arson and theft of household silver, 15 years. He has served 7. He said it the way a man recites a thing he has been carrying in his mouth for days, turning it over, wearing it smooth. He did not lean on the counter. He did not raise his voice. He stood as if the registry were a forecourt and I were the palace gate, and the stillness of him was so complete that the 2 clerks behind me stopped writing. And you are? Corporal Emmet Larke, 2nd Company, King's Household Guard. I am on the night watch over the chapel works. He glanced down at the box once and then back at me, and his eyes were gray and very tired. I found this behind the vestry paneling. I have not opened it in front of anyone. I would like you to be the first, because you are the registrar, and because I think what is in it belongs in a file that I am told does not exist. Every file exists, Corporal. Then let us go and look at that one, he said. I should have sent him to the watch. That is the correct procedure, and I knew it while I was not doing it. The registry does not open boxes. The registry receives, indexes, shelves, and produces. We are a memory, not a mouth. But I was already turning the lid, and my thumb was still smarting from the date wheel, and I remember that the hinge shrieked, and that one of the clerks, young Devrin, who has since become a better man than his beginnings promised, actually stood up on his stool to see. Inside there was a folded card, the sort of verger writes on. And there were things. A silver pocket watch case, hinged, blackened along one edge as though it had lain against something hot. A signet ring, heavy, its stone gone, the gold buckled a little on one side. A white glove, scorched to the color of weak tea, of a make no guardsman wears, a gentleman's evening glove, kid leather, the seam split. A brass key on a green ribbon, and a pawnbroker's ticket, browned and brittle, folded into eighths. Corporal Larke did not touch any of it. He put his hands behind his back and stood there with the rainwater dripping off the peak of his brow, and he said, "Would you read the card, ma'am?" I read it aloud, because my voice needed something to do. Found in the ash of the south aisle the morning after, kept safe, be quill verger. I have twice asked the watch to come and take these, and they have not come. If I die before they come, someone honest is to have them. Nobody in the registry said anything. Rain hit the high windows in handfuls. Somewhere below us a court usher was calling a list, and the sound of a name being called in an empty corridor is a very lonely sound. I picked up the watch case. It was cold and it was heavier than I expected, and on the inside of the lid, where a man has his initials cut so that a thief cannot easily sell it, there were 3 letters, engraved in a hand so fine it must have cost more than my month's salary. GST. I set it down very carefully, the way you set down something that has begun to tick. "Corporal," I said, and my mouth had gone dry, "do you know whose initials those are?" "I know one man in this realm they could be," he said. "I would rather you said it, ma'am. If I say it, I am a guardsman making an accusation. If you say it, you are the registrar reading an exhibit." That was the first moment I understood what kind of man had walked into my registry. He was not reckless. He had thought about the shape of the fall before he stepped off the ledge, and he had worked out exactly how much of it he could take on himself and how much he would have to ask others to carry, and he had come to ask politely in the rain at 9:04. I did not say the name, not that morning. I want that in the record too. What I said was, "Bring the box back at 6 when the registry closes, and I will pull the case bundle." He inclined his head about an inch. He put the lid back on the tin. He tucked the box under his arm where the bearskin had been, and he went out into the rain, and the doors swung and were still. Devrin sat back down on his stool. "Ma'am," he said, "wasn't the Ashgrove man the one who—" "Yes," I said, "he made the window." That is the thing about the Ashgrove Chapel fire that nobody in this realm has ever been able to hold comfortably in the mind, and it is why the case ran so hot and finished so fast. The window that burned, the great south window, the memorial window, the one the late Queen Isolde's household had commissioned for her in the year after her death, with its 7 panels of ordinary people going about ordinary work, because she had asked for no angels and no crowns. That window had been built by hand over 2 years by a glazier's yard on Cutter's Lane. And the man who cut and leaded most of it, who slept some nights on the bench beside it because the lead ran better when he did not have to start cold, was a young journeyman named Tobin Ferrow. And Tobin Ferrow was the man they hanged the fire on. Not literally. We do not hang men for arson in Eldermore, and we have not for 100 years. We give them 15 years in Stonefell, which is a stone building on a stone hill above a stone sea, and which is in many ways a slower thing. The motive was tidy. That was what everyone said at the time, admiringly, the way you would admire a well-made box. It was tidy. The glazier's yard had never been paid its final installment. There had been a dispute with the household's works office, letters, an arbitration that went nowhere, and Ferrow's master had gone bankrupt and died within the year. And Ferrow, a young man, hot-headed, they said, a drinker, they said, though no one who knew him ever said it, had been heard to say he would sooner see the window in pieces than see it in a chapel that had cheated him. He had been at the chapel that evening. That was not in dispute. He had delivered a barrel of lamp oil to the vestry, because the glazier's yard also supplied oil, and he had collected a bag of tools he had left in the south aisle. He had signed the delivery, and he had gone. At 2:50 in the morning, the chapel burned. By dawn the window was slag and color running down the inside of the wall. The chapel silver 2-candle standards, a salver, a set of bosses was gone. The verger, Barnaby Quill, an old man who lived in 2 rooms behind the vestry, had gone in to save what he could, and had come out with a beam burn across one hand and a deafness in his left ear he never lost. And 11 days later, in a room in the watch house on Lantern Row, Tobin Ferrow signed a confession. I was 26 then, and I was a junior clerk, and my job at the winter sitting was to receive the exhibits, index them, and carry the bundle up to the bench, which meant that on the second morning of the trial I stood at the clerk's table with the confession in my hands, and I looked at it, and something in me went very quiet and stayed quiet for 7 years. Because on the first page of that document, the fair copy, the one that goes to the bench, the one the judge reads, Tobin Ferrow had signed his name. A full signature. Looping, confident, the *T crossed with a flourish, the *W* trailing off into a little tail, the signature of a man who signs things often and likes doing it. And I had, that same morning, in the exhibit bundle in my other hand, the delivery note from the chapel vestry, the one he had signed on the evening of the fire. On the delivery note Tobin Ferrow had made a mark, a cross, and beside it in the vestry clerk's hand, T. Ferrow his mark. I stood there with a piece of paper in each hand, and I felt the floor of the world tilt very slightly, and then a man behind me said, "Kell, the bench is waiting," and I carried both papers up the steps and laid them down and went back to my table. Later that day, I did the one brave thing I did for 7 years. I went to the clerk of the court, who was a decent man called Hosmer, and I said, "Sir, the accused signs with a mark on one exhibit and a signature on another, and I do not understand it." And Hosmer looked at the ceiling for a while, and then he said, and I remember every word, "Some men can write their names and cannot write anything else, Kell. Some men make a mark because the vestry clerk is in a hurry. It is not for us. We are the registry. Take it to the defense." So I took it to the defense. The defense was a young advocate assigned by the court. The Ferrows had no money, and he had 11 cases that fortnight, and he heard me out on the stairs and he said he would raise it, and he did raise it, and the prosecution said that the accused had learned to write his name in the 11 days he was held, which was, he said, a common thing among the newly literate and hardly a mystery. And the judge wrote a word down and the trial went on, and on the 4th day it ended, and a man went to Stonefell for 15 years. And I went back to my counter and I was promoted, and I kept my quiet, and every year the winter sitting came round and I stamped the writs and I did not think about it. That is not true. I thought about it perhaps 4 times a year, generally at night, for perhaps 90 seconds, and then I stopped, the way you take your hand off a hot rail. So when Corporal Emmet Larke came in from the rain and set his box down and asked me who had witnessed Tobin Ferrow's mark, he was not asking me a question. He was reading my own handwriting back to me. I pulled the bundle at 5:30 before the registry closed, and I did it alone, and I did not tell the clerks. Case 740. One of the winter sitting lives on the 4th floor of the Assize Repository, which is a long room with a ceiling like an overturned boat and 41 bays of shelving, and which smells of dust and iron and the vinegar they used to use on the mold. Each case bundle is a canvas envelope with a red tape, and inside it in strict order are the pleadings, the depositions, the exhibits list, the exhibits themselves where they are paper, and tucked in the back the asterisk inventory, a printed card filled by hand, listing every item that ever came into the file, with a line and an initial for each item that ever left. Bundle 741 was on shelf J, Bay 19, second from the end, and it was thin. That was the first thing my hands told me before my mind caught up. A 4-day arson trial with 16 witnesses and a confession is not thin. It should have been the width of my palm. It was the width of 2 fingers. I carried it to the long table under the north lights, and I untied the tape, and I laid the contents out in order, and then I read the inventory card. There were 19 items listed on that card. There were 14 in the bundle. I read the card 3 times, standing up with my knuckles on the table. The 5 that were gone were listed in a clerk's neat hand, with the date each had been entered, and in the withdrawal column a stroke and an initial and nothing else. No requisition number, no receiving officer, no return date. D9. Statement of the accused, first draft, in the hand of the taking officer with the accused's mark. D9A. Note of the taking officer as to the manner of the mark. E4. Register of the chapel yard gate, night of the fire, original leaf. Asterisk E11. Statement of B. Quill, verger, as to items recovered from the ash. F2. Pawn ticket produced by the watch, provenance not established. I sat down, eventually. I remember the chair being colder than chairs are. Somebody had gone into my repository, into my bays, with a key to my shelves, and had taken out of a closed and completed case file the only 5 documents in the realm that could have told anyone that Tobin Ferrow had signed his confession with a cross, that the verger had found a gentleman's watch case in the ashes, and that a pawnbroker somewhere in this city had once been handed a piece of the Ashgrove Chapel silver by a hand that was not Tobin Ferrow's. And the initial in the withdrawal column, 5 times in the same small, patient, unhurried hand, was a single letter. P***. At 6 o'clock, Corporal Larke came back with the reins still on him and the tin box under his arm, and I met him at the doors of the Registry, and I did not let him inside. "Not here," I said. He looked at my face for about a second and a half. "Ma'am," he said, "what's missing?" "Everything," I said, "everything that would have saved him." We talked in a chop house on Vintners Row, in a booth at the back, with his bearskin on the seat beside him like a third person at the table. He ate nothing. He drank 1 cup of tea and let it go cold and turned the cup around by the handle, a quarter turn at a time, all the while I spoke. I told him about the mark and the signature. I told him what I had done about it, which was almost nothing, and what had come of it, which was less. I did not dress it up. He listened to the end without moving his face, and when I had finished, he said the only thing he could have said that would have kept me at that table. "You told the defense," he said. "You went up the stairs and you told a man whose job it was to hear it. Then a court with a judge in it decided it was nothing." He turned the cup another quarter. "You were a junior clerk. You did the whole of what a junior clerk could do, and the system ate it. That is not the same as saying nothing, ma'am. But it is not the same as saying it again, either." "No," I said, "it isn't." "So say it again," he said, "louder with me." I asked him then why he cared. It is a rude question, and I asked it rudely because I was frightened and because he was so calm and because I wanted to find the hook in him, a grudge, an ambition, a story he was trying to be the hero of. I have worked in courts for a long time. Everybody has a hook. He looked at the window a while. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, and the lamps had come on, and the wet cobbles were throwing them back doubled. "Before I was a guardsman," he said, "I was on the prison escort 4 years. You take the wagon from the assize court to Stonefell and you take it back empty. It's a job for men who can be trusted not to talk to the freight." He said the word *freight without any expression at all, which is how I knew what he thought of it. In the spring of my 2nd year I escorted a glazier's man from the court to the coast, 26 years old. He'd been given 15. He didn't cry and he didn't curse and he didn't sleep, and about halfway there, when the wagon stopped to water the horses, he asked me a question through the grill. He stopped turning the cup. He asked me whether somebody would tell his mother where he'd gone. He said she was not well and she would sit up. He said he had been arrested on a Tuesday and it was now the 28th day, and nobody had told her anything except that he was in the watch house and she would be sitting up. "And did you?" I said. "I did. I went to Cutter's Lane on my next Liberty Day and I found the house and I told Nell Ferrow that her son was at Stonefell and that he was in good health and that he had asked after her." He looked up at me. "And then I forgot him, ma'am, completely, for 7 years. I got my transfer to the household guard, and I learned to stand still for 3 hours at a time and think about nothing, which is a skill they teach you, and I was good at it. And a fortnight ago I was put on the night watch over the Ashgrove works, and I was standing in the burnt shell of that chapel at 2 in the morning with a lantern, and the restorers had taken down the vestry paneling that day, and there was a tin box sitting in the cavity with the word found scratched on it." He put the cup down, and I opened it and I read the verger's card and I thought, I know that name. And then I thought, I have carried that name. I put him in the wagon myself. He turned his hands over on the table, palms up, white gloves off, and looked at them without any drama at all. "I've stood a lot of hours since then," he said. "It's a lot of hours to think in. I want to be exact about what he did next, because the men who later called him a fanatic and a glory hunter and a liar have never once had to explain why a fanatic would proceed so slowly, so correctly, and so much in writing. He did not go to the newspapers. He did not go to the palace. He did not go to Princess Adela, though he could have. The restoration of the Ashgrove Chapel was hers. her own commission for the 10th year of the late Queen Isolde's memory, and Adela is not a woman who lets a thing lie once she has been shown it. He went to his sergeant major. His name was Corporal Emmet, and he had been 31 years in the household guard, and he had a face like a closed door. Larke stood at attention in the orderly room at 7 the next morning and made a verbal report, and then he made a written one in his own hand, on the correct form, and he asked that it be forwarded to the provost's office. Bellamy read the written report twice. Then he put it face down on his desk and put his hand flat on it, which is a thing I have thought about often since. "Corporal," he said, "what do you want me to do with this?" "Forward it, sir." "To the provost, who will forward it to the watch who investigated the case and to the court of assize who tried it." Bellamy did not raise his voice. "Do you know who sits at the top of the court of assize, Larke?" "The Lord Chancellor, sir." "Say his name." "Lord Sabian Thorn, sir." "And the letters in your box?" Larke did not answer that. Bellamy waited a long time and then answered it himself, quietly, and it was the first time anyone in this story said it out loud. "Gaverick Sabian Thorn," he said, "the Lord Chancellor's son." The rain had stopped. There was a bugle going somewhere out on the parade, and men shouting, and the ordinary noise of an ordinary morning in a barracks that had stood for 200 years, and intended to stand for 200 more. "Sir," Larke said, "I don't say it's his watch case. I say it's *** watch case with those letters on it, found in the ash by the verger and offered twice to the watch, and the watch didn't come. I say the verger's statement is missing from the file. I say the man's confession is signed with a signature, and every other paper he ever touched is signed with a cross. I don't need to know whose watch it is. I need someone to ** ask. And if the answer ruins the second most powerful man in the realm, then I expect it will ruin me first, sir," Larke said. "That's usually the order it happens in." Bellamy told me, years afterwards, that he had come within one breath of tearing the report in half, and that the thing that stopped him was not honor and not law. It was that he had been at the winter sitting himself, as an usher's escort, on the day the sentence was read, and he had watched the young man in the dock look around the courtroom for his mother's face, and not find it, because Nell Ferrow had been too ill to come, and nobody had told him she was ill. Bellamy forwarded the report. Then he called Larke back and said one more thing, and this is the thing I want people to remember when they talk about the household guard as though it were only cloth and drill. "Corporal," he said, "from this morning you will be correct, not clever, not brave, correct. Every hour of duty stood, every button, every form, because they will not come at your evidence, Larke. They will come at you **, and they will use the smallest thing they can find, and I would very much like there to be nothing for them to find." Larke said, "Sir." He was, from that morning, the most correct soldier in the king's household guard, and it did not save him at all, and it saved everything. The gate books came next, and the gate books are why a guardsman found this, and not a lawyer. Every entrance to the palace precinct and the Ashgrove Chapel stands inside the precinct. At the far end of the walled garden behind its own low iron gate is a **post**. Every post keeps a book. Every soul who passes, on foot or in a carriage or in a motor, is entered by the sentry in the book. The hour, the name, the business, the countersign of the officer of the guard. The books go to the guard register room and they are kept forever, because the household guard is an old institution, and old institutions do not throw things away. They merely lose them slowly, which is not the same. Larke went to the register room on a Thursday with a signed chit from Bellamy, and asked for the chapel yard gate book for the winter 7 years ago. They gave it to him. There is no secret about it, it is simply a book. He carried it to the reading desk and turned to the night of the fire, and there it was, the whole night in a clean, clear hand. 9 o'clock 10:11, the vestry deliveries, the verger returning from his sister's, the works foreman and T. Ferrow, glazier's man, tools collected, out 11:1 p.m. Out at 11:10, 2.5 hours before the fire. That entry alone was not proof of anything. A man can leave a gate and come back over a wall. The prosecution had said exactly that 7 years ago, and it had been enough. But Larke was not looking at what the page said. He was looking at the page. He told me later in his flat way that a sentry spends a very great deal of his life staring at objects he is not permitted to touch, and that this ruins a man for casual looking. He notices the third button. He notices the loose thread. He noticed that Thursday that the leaf he was reading did not sit right in the gutter of the book, that where every other page ran straight to the stitching, this one had a shadow of a margin, a fractional wrongness, the kind of thing you would never see unless you had nothing to do but see. He put his finger in the gutter, and he leaned down and looked along the spine. The stitching holes did not match. There were 7 old holes in the binding thread and 5 in the leaf, and the leaf had been trimmed at the inner edge, very finely, by somebody with a good blade and a steady hand and glued. And the ink was wrong, not the color, the asterisk behavior. The household guard's register ink is an iron gall that bites and browns with age. Every other page in that book had gone the color of strong tea at the edges of every stroke. The page he was holding was still black. Somebody had cut the true leaf out of the King's Own Gate book and put a false one in its place, and had been careful enough to copy Tobin Ferrow's departure at 11:1 p.m., because they asterisk wanted Ferrow's departure on the page. It hurt them not at all, and had been careless enough to use the wrong ink, because it had been 7 years, and who, in the name of all that is reasonable, was ever going to look? Larke did not take the book. He did not tear the page. He went to the desk sergeant of the register room, and he made a formal minute in the visitor's log in his own hand, timed and dated. CPL E. Larke, 2nd Coy. Chapel Yard Gate Book, Winter Sitting Year, Night of the 14th. Leaf appears substituted. Reported to SGT Maj Bellamy this day. Book left in place, undamaged. Then he saluted the desk sergeant, who did not deserve it and was quite bewildered by it, and he walked out. 4 days later, the guard register room was closed to all ranks below captain, pending an audit of holdings. That was the first shot. It was fired at paper, and it was fired by someone who had heard within 4 days that a corporal had put his finger on a stitching hole. I remember Larke telling me about the closure, standing under the registry colonnade in the wind with his gloves in his fist. "They've locked the room," he said. "Then we've lost the book," I said. "No, ma'am," he said. "They've asterisk told me the leaf was cut." And for the first and almost the last time in the whole of this business, Corporal Emmet Larke smiled, a small, grim, entirely joyless movement of the mouth. An honest audit doesn't lock the door before it counts. Barnaby Quill lived in an almshouse on the north side of the river, in a room with a window that looked at another window, and he was 81 years old, and he had waited 7 years for someone to knock. Larke had his Liberty Day on the Sunday, and he spent it crossing the city on foot. He took me with him. I have never worked out whether that was because he wanted a witness of standing, or because he had decided, in his methodical way, that a woman who had once carried a paper up a flight of steps and been told to leave it there ought to be made to walk the rest of the distance. He never said. I have chosen to believe both. The old man knew him for a guardsman before we were through the door, and he stood up out of his chair with the terrible eagerness of a person who has been waiting a very long time to be believed. "You've come about the box," he said. "I have," Larke said. "I told them," Quill said. His voice was too loud. The deafness in the left ear had shifted his sense of his own volume, and he never got it back. "I told them twice. I went to Lantern Row and I said, I have things out of the ash and they should be looked at, and a constable took my name and said a man would come. and a man came. I said a man came. A man came, said Barnaby Quill, and sat down again slowly, but he never took the box. He told it to us the way an old man tells a thing he has rehearsed alone, out of order, circling back, sure of the wrong details and unshakable on the right ones. 11 days after the fire, a constable had come to the chapel and had not been in uniform and had not written anything down. He had asked to see what Quill had found. Quill had shown him the tin. The man had looked into it for some time. He had picked up the watch case and turned it to the light and read the letters inside the lid, and he had put it back, and he had said, "You've had a bad shock, Dad. Your hand's a mess and you can't hear. Nobody's blaming you for anything. Now this is ash out of a fire, and half the parish walked through that aisle, and there's nothing in there that belongs to the case, and if you go dragging it into a court, a clever advocate will make you look like a fool who kept a gentleman's watch he found. Do you want that at your age?" And Barnaby Quill, who had been given a decoration by the household for going back into a burning chapel with a beam coming down, and who had lost his hearing and half the use of a hand for it, and who was terrified of the courts because he had never in 81 years spoken in one, had said, "No, sir." And the man had said, "Good. Keep it safe then and forget it," and had gone away. Quill had kept it safe. He had put a card in the tin in case he died. And then the workmen came to board up the chapel, and the vergery was closed, and he was moved to the almshouse, and the tin went into the wall cavity behind the vestry paneling because he had nowhere else that was chapel, and it seemed to him a thing that ought to stay with the chapel, and he had been quite certain, he said, that one day somebody honest would take the paneling down. Larke was very quiet for a moment. "You were right," he said. 7 years, said Quill. "Yes. That poor lad made that window," the old man said. "He used to come at 6 and I'd let him in the side door and he'd stand and look at it before he started, every morning, just look at it. He wiped his face with the back of the burned hand, unaware he was doing it. They put it about that he hated it. He loved it. He was the only one of them that loved it." Then Larke asked the question he had walked 5 miles to ask. "Mr. Quill," he said, "the constable who came to see you and told you to forget it, would you know him again?" "I would." "Do you know his name?" "I do now," said Barnaby Quill, "for I saw his picture in the paper when they made him chief. He was thinner then, but it was him. And he told us the name, and I wrote it in my notebook with a hand that was not entirely steady. And it was the same letter that stood 5 times in the withdrawal column of the inventory card of case 741. Rolf Pike. Then a sergeant of the watch, taking statements on the Ashgrove fire. Now the chief constable of the city watch, with 300 men under him and a house in Selby Crescent. Promoted, I checked it later in the Gazette, which anyone may read, and no one ever does 19 days after Tobin Ferrow signed his confession. I have called this a wall of institutional resistance, and people hear that phrase and imagine a wall. They imagine men in a room deciding to crush a corporal. It was not like that. It was so much worse than that because it required almost nobody to decide anything. What happened was that 100 reasonable people each did one small reasonable thing. The register room was closed for an audit, a proper audit, minuted, signed, entirely regular, ordered by a captain who had received a memorandum from a colonel who had received a note from the provost's office observing that the holdings had not been surveyed in 11 years, which was true. Nobody in that chain was corrupt. The note simply arrived at exactly the right moment, from a direction nobody afterwards could name. Larke's request for the case bundle of 741 came back marked * closed file, application to be made in writing to the clerk of the court. He applied in writing. It came back marked the clerk of the court is unable to accede to applications from parties without standing. He applied for standing. It came back marked asterisk, standing in a concluded criminal matter lies with the convicted person or his advocate. He wrote to Tobin Ferrow at Stonefell, asking him to appoint him. The letter came back 3 weeks later, unopened, stamped asterisk prisoner declines correspondence. Larke held that envelope for a long while. He didn't decline it, he said. He never saw it. And he was right, and it took us 4 months to prove it, and by then everything had happened. Then the small hurts began, and they came so gently that a less careful man would have missed the pattern. His liberty days were altered, not canceled, altered so that they never fell on a court day. A guardsman on liberty may go where he likes, a guardsman on duty may not. It is entirely lawful to arrange a duty roster. The roster was arranged. His application to sit the examination for sergeant, which had been in for a year, was returned for want of a signature that had never before been required, and was never required of anyone else. And in the 8th week, Corporal Emmet Larke was posted to the Ashmore Gate. There is no shame in the Ashmore Gate. That is the beauty of it. It is a perfectly respectable post, the northern service entrance of the outer precinct where the coal comes in, 4 miles from the barracks, on a road across an open moor that takes the wind straight off the fells with nothing to break it. 2 sentries, a stove that smokes. No public, no ceremony, no visitors, nobody at all from 1 week's end to the next but a coal contractor and a butcher's van. It is where you send a man you wish to bore into silence. I went out to see him there once in the January of it, because he had missed 2 of our meetings, and I had begun to be afraid he had stopped. I took the omnibus to the end of the line and walked the last 2 miles into a wind that made my eyes stream, and I came up the road, and I saw the gate a long way off, and I saw him. He was standing at his post, perfectly straight, rifle at his shoulder, eyes forward on an empty road in the middle of an empty moor, with sleet coming across it sideways, guarding a coal gate that nobody in the world wanted to pass. And on the sill of the sentry box, under a stone to stop the wind taking it, was a sheet of paper, and on the paper was a list, written out in his small square hand, of everything he still had to prove, and every way he could think of to prove it, and beside each one a note of what he had already tried and what it had cost. He had crossed 9 of them out. There were 11 left. "Corporal," I said, when he was stood down and we could speak, "they can keep you here for 4 years. "Yes, ma'am." "They will keep you here until you are 40, and then they will give you a good discharge and a decent word. And Tobin Ferrow will have served 14 of his 15, and it will not matter any more. And that is what they are doing, and it will work." He handed me a mug of tea that tasted of tin and stove smoke. "They've made a mistake, though," he said. "Have they?" "They sent me somewhere with nothing to do." He nodded down the road, where there was nothing, all the way to a gray horizon. A man on the palace forecourt has to think about the crowd. Out here I have 11 hours a day and nothing to look at, and I have been doing what I was trained to do, which is to keep looking at the thing everyone else has stopped looking at. "And what have you seen?" "The carbon," he said. I did not understand him. He explained it to me the way he explained everything, slowly and in order, and without once suggesting that I was slow. "The gate book is kept by the sentry," he said. "You know that. But a gate book is not an official return, ma'am. It's a working book. At the end of each watch, the officer of the guard makes his asterisk return, the summary of the watch, and that goes to the adjutant. And because the household guard is old and suspicious, the return is written in a duplicate book, with a carbon leaf between, and the top copy goes to the adjutant and the asterisk counterfoil stays in the book asterisk, and the book stays with the company, not with the register room." He let that sit. "They cut a leaf out of the gate book," he said. "They never touched the company's return book. I don't believe they knew it existed. Half the officers in the guard don't know it exists. It's a counterfoil in a battered black book in the bottom of an orderly room press, and nobody has looked at one for 100 years because why would you? The gate book is the record, I said very carefully, and the return for the night of the 14th. Second company held the chapel yard that winter, said Corporal Larke. Second company is my company. The book is in my orderly room. He wrapped both hands around his mug. It is 8 feet from Sergeant Major Bellamy's desk, and it has been for 7 years, and I walked past it every morning for 3 of them. The sleet came across the moor and rattled on the roof of the sentry box like a handful of gravel. What does it say? I said. I don't know yet, he said. I'm not going to sneak in and read it, ma'am. If I take it, it's stolen and it's worth nothing. It has to be produced, properly, by an officer, on a demand that can be written down. Then how? That, said Larke, is the 11 things on the list. The thing that changed the shape of it, that turned it from a wrong done to one man into something I have not been able to put down since, arrived in an envelope from a landlord. I had gone looking for Nell Ferrow. It was not clever detection. It was housekeeping. Larke was frozen at a coal gate on a moor, and I was the one with a desk in the city, and I thought, if we are ever to file anything, we will need the convicted man's next of kin, because next of kin can appoint an advocate, and an advocate has standing, and standing is the door we cannot open. Nell Ferrow was not at Cutter's Lane. Nell Ferrow had died 2 years ago, in a bed in the back room of number 11, of a long illness that the Registrar of Deaths had recorded in 4 words. But she had been at number 11 on Cutter's Lane for the whole of those 5 years, and Cutter's Lane, in the year Tobin was convicted, had been sold to a development company, and every tenant in it had been served notice, and the whole terrace had been emptied and rebuilt, and the rents had trebled. Every tenant except one. I went to the agent's office, and I did the only thing my office has ever been good for, which is to be extremely tedious in an official voice for a long time. I asked to see the rent book for number 11. The clerk did not want to show me. I quoted him a section of the landlord and tenant regulation which I am fairly sure does not apply, and he found the book. From the spring of the year Tobin Ferrow was convicted, the rent on number 11 Cutter's Lane had been paid, quarterly, in advance, without fail, for 5 years, until the death of the tenant. And it had been paid not by Nell Ferrow, who had no money and could not have paid a tenth of it, but by a standing order from an account at a private bank in Weir Street, in the name of a trust with a name like a cough, the Elderfield Settlement. Paid on the same day of the quarter, every quarter, 20 times. And in the margin of the rent book, against the very first payment in the agent's hand, a note that told me the whole of a man's soul, gentleman called in person, would not leave name, wished it clearly understood that the tenant is not to be told, nor to be disturbed, nor served notice while she lives. I sat in that agent's office with my hands in my lap, and I felt the thing turn over. Because a man who covers up a crime hides. He does not pay the rent of the mother of the man he framed, for 5 years, quarterly, in advance, and stand in a rent agent's office insisting she is not to be disturbed. That is not a criminal covering his tracks. That is a coward with a conscience, being managed by somebody who has none. The Elderfield Settlement. I looked it up in the Register of Trusts, which is a public document that nobody reads, and I sat in the reading room of the probate office for 2 hours, and I found that the Elderfield Settlement had been created 11 years before, for the benefit of the second son of a noble house, on his majority, and that its trustees were a firm of solicitors on Ember Row, and that the firm on Ember Row acted, and had acted for 40 years, for the household of the Lord Chancellor. And I understood, sitting there with the dusk going round in the window-light, that Gavrick Thorne had been paying Nell Ferrow's rent since the spring of the trial, and that he had gone on paying it after she died, for 2 full quarters, until somebody noticed and stopped it, and that in 7 years he had never once gone to see her, and never once told anybody, and never once said a word. He was not the wall. He was a man walled up inside it, and he had been in there as long as Tobin Ferrow. I took it to Larke on the moor, and he read the rent book copies twice, and then he looked out at the sleet for a long time. "Ma'am," he said, "how many men has Rolfe Pike convicted on a confession signed with a mark?" I said, "I beg your pardon." "You keep the records." "How many?" It took me 11 days, working at night, in my own repository, going bay by bay through the calendar of every criminal sitting for the 3 years around the Ashgrove fire, pulling the fair copies, looking at nothing but the last line of the last page. I found 11. 11 convictions secured by the watch under then Sergeant Rolfe Pike in 3 years, in which the accused was a man who could not write, a carter, a dock laborer, a knacker's boy, a woman who took in washing, and who had, according to the file, signed a full and fluent confession, and in 9 of those 11 the confession was the whole of the case. 6 of them were still inside. I laid the list on the table in the sentry box at Ashmore, and I could not speak for a bit, and Emmet Larke read it down to the bottom, and when he looked up his face had changed, and I saw, for the first and only time, what was underneath the stillness. "It's not a cover-up," he said. "It's a asterisk method asterisk." "Yes." "They didn't invent it for Ferrow." He put his finger on the third name. "Ferrow was just the one where the method got used to hide something big. The rest of the time it was used because it's quick, and because it works, and because nobody has ever once looked at the last line of the last page." He stood up. The little box was too small for him to stand up in properly, and he had to bend his neck, and he stood there bent with his fists on the table. "Ma'am, I have been standing at that gate telling myself, I owe one man a wagon ride. And now there are 6 men in Stonefell tonight," he said, "and I know all their names, and none of them can write them. Here is where it looked as though we had one, and I would like to be able to say that I was not fooled. I was completely fooled. Princess Adela came to the Ashgrove Works in the last week of February. She came because it was her restoration. She had signed the warrant for it. She had chosen the glaziers. She had fought the works office for the money, and she is a woman who inspects what she has paid for. She came without ceremony, in a plain coat, with one lady and one equerry, and she walked the length of the burnt aisle with the master restorer explaining the scaffolding, and she stopped at the empty stone frame of the south window, where the memorial window had been, and she stood looking at nothing for rather a long time. And then she said to nobody in particular, "Who found the box?" Larke had been brought in from Ashmore for the day, because the guard does not send its Coalgate sentries to meet a princess, and yet it had to send somebody who could say where the box had been, and there was exactly one man who could. I have often wondered which junior officer made that decision, and whether he ever understood what he had done. Larke stepped forward and said, "I did, ma'am. I was not there. I have this from him, from her equerry, and from the master restorer, and the 3 accounts agree, which in my profession is close to a miracle." She asked him what was in it. He told her in 11 words without ornament. She asked him what he had done about it. He told her. The report, the sergeant major, the provost, the applications, all of them with dates. She asked him what had happened. And Corporal Emmet Larke, standing in the burnt shell of a chapel in front of the king's sister with his bearskin under his arm, said, "The register room was closed, ma'am. My applications were refused for want of standing. And I was posted to the Ashmore gate. There is a silence, they say, that Princess Adela does, that is worse than shouting." She said, "Who is the convicted man?" "Tobin Ferrow, ma'am. He made your brother's wife's window. He is in the 7th year of 15. And Adela looked up at the empty stone frame, where the 7 panels of ordinary people doing ordinary work had been, and she said, "And every one of the 3 accounts has this identically, so I believe it is exact." "He made it." "Yes, ma'am." "And you say he is innocent?" "I say, ma'am, that nobody has looked. which is not the same thing, but it is the thing I would want looked into if it were my name. Adela turned around and said to her equerry, "Note this. The Registrar of the Court of Assize is to produce the bundle in case 741 of the Winter sitting to my office, entire, with the inventory card, by Friday. The guard register room is to produce the chapel yard gate book for the same period. I want the verger found, and I want him comfortable while we find out whether he has been ignored for 7 years by servants of my brother's household." She looked at Larke. "And this man is to be returned to his company." That was Wednesday. By Friday morning, when the demand for the bundle reached my desk with the princess's seal on it, I was so nearly happy that I ran up the stairs to the 4th floor. Bundle 740, one was not on shelf J, Bay 19. It was not anywhere, the shelf card was gone. The repository daybook showed no withdrawal. It had not been signed out, because you cannot sign out what you have simply asterisk taken, and somebody with a key had walked into the assize repository between 6 on Wednesday evening and 8 on Friday morning, and removed the entire canvas envelope of a concluded criminal case, and there is no procedure for that, and therefore there is no record of it, and therefore, officially, it did not happen. I stood in Bay 19 with the princess's demand in my hand, and I began to shake, and I could not stop for about 4 minutes. And at 9:30 that same morning, in the 2nd Company orderly room, 4 men of the provost's staff opened Corporal Emmet Larke's kit locker, in the presence of his sergeant major, on a written information laid by a person unnamed. Wrapped in a shirt at the bottom of the locker, they found a silver candle boss, blackened by fire, of the pattern of the Ashgrove Chapel service, listed on the works inventory of salvaged fittings under the number 14, and marked missing from the site store since the 19th of January. They arrested him at 10 minutes to 10. They marched him across the barrack square between 2 men, and he went at attention in step, without a word, and Sergeant Major Bellamy stood in the door of the orderly room and watched him go, and did not speak either, because there was nothing in the world he was permitted to say. The charge was theft of Crown property from a royal works site. The maximum sentence was 7 years. 7, I have never decided whether that was a joke somebody made, or simply the way the law fell. I have not been able to make myself believe it was an accident. They came for me on the Monday, and they came very politely, which is how they do it. The clerk of the court, not old Hosmer, who had retired, but a smooth, careful man called Marrow, who had been appointed by the Chancellor's office, asked me to sit down in his room and gave me tea. He said that the loss of a bundle from the repository was a grave irregularity, and that a full inquiry would of course be held. He said that the inquiry would naturally have to consider the conduct of the registrar, whose sole and personal responsibility the repository was. He said that he had been looking at my service, and that it was long and it was good, and that in 11 years there had been no complaint of any kind, and that this was exactly why he was so anxious to help me. He said that a registrar who resigned for reasons of health at her own request before an inquiry opened kept her pension entire. And he said, leaning forward kindly, with his hands folded, and I could smell his hair oil, that a registrar who was found by an inquiry to have permitted a guardsman under criminal charge to handle a closed criminal file, and to have gone with him to interview a witness in that file, and to have made unauthorized searches of 11 other files at night, would not keep it. "You have been very unlucky in your friends, Madame Kell," he said. "That is all it is, unlucky. I want to set down here plainly that I went home that night and I got out my writing case and I wrote the letter. Sir, I regret to inform you that by reason of health I must ask leave to relinquish." I got that far. And then I sat there in my own kitchen with the lamp on and the pen in my hand, and I thought about a young woman of 26 standing at a clerk's table with a piece of paper in each hand, feeling the floor of the world tilt and putting them both down and going back to her work. And I thought, they are not asking me to be frightened. Anybody may be frightened. They are asking me to do the asterisk same thing twice. They are asking me to be a person who is shown this, in her own hands, in her own building, and puts it down, and goes back to her work. And to be that person not once, as a girl, on a morning when she did not understand what she was holding, but again, asterisk, at 43, knowing exactly what she is holding, and knowing there are 6 men in Stonefell who cannot write their names. I burned the letter in the grate. It took a long time. A good writing paper does not burn well. Then I went to the repository at 5 in the morning, and I did the thing that I have been told, by people who ought to know, is the single most important thing anybody did in the whole of this affair, and which took me 19 days. The Court of Assize does not destroy paper. It has never destroyed paper. It is a very old institution, and it is very poor. And for 140 years it has done what a very old, very poor institution does with its spoiled sheets, its miswritten drafts, its superseded copies, and its waste paper. It presses asterisk them. The press board on which every ledger of that court is bound, the stiff gray board inside the leather of every day book, every calendar, every register on every shelf of that building, is made in the court's own bindery, in the basement, out of the court's own waste, pulped and pressed and dried. Pulped asterisk when the bindery is working properly. And the bindery had not worked properly in the winter of the Ashgrove trial, because the pulping engine had broken in the November, and the bindery had spent that whole winter making its board the old way, the lazy way, the way an overworked binder makes board when the engine is down, by asterisk laminating, pasting waste sheets flat, one on another, 6 deep, and putting them under the screw press overnight. I knew this because I had signed the repair order for the pulping engine 11 years ago as a junior clerk, and because it is my business to know what is in my own basement. So I went down to the bindery, and I found the ledgers bound in the spring after the fire, and I took them off the shelf, 41 of them, and I carried them up 2 at a time, and I sat at the long table under the north lights for 19 nights with a bone folder and a basin of warm water and a sponge. And I took them apart, board by board, sheet by sheet, wetting the paste, lifting the laminations, drying them flat under weights, and reading every single one, court lists, blotted writs, a cook's order for the judge's luncheon, a letter from a widow, 11 copies of an oath. On the 17th night, in the second board of the bound daybook of the Court of Assize for the spring quarter, 3rd sheet down, pasted face to the gray, and lifted off whole and legible, with the water still shining on it. Statement of the accused, Tobin Ferrow, taken by me at the watch house, Lantern Row, this 11th day. 4 pages in a rapid, impatient hand. The taking officer's own draft, not the fair copy. The draft, the original, the words as they came out of a frightened young man's mouth after 11 days. And at the bottom of the 4th page, in a place where the paper had gone soft with old finger grease from being held down hard, a cross. And beside it, in the taking officer's hand, 4 words that had been in the wall of a book on a shelf in my own repository for 7 years. T. Ferrow, his mark. And beneath that, initialed and dated, folded once, still attached, D9A, the note of the taking officer as to the manner of the mark. The accused being unable to write, the same was read over to him, and he made his mark. He asked twice what would happen to his mother. He was told he would be helped in that regard if he was sensible. R. Pike, S.G.T. I sat in my own repository at 3 o'clock in the morning, with a wet sheet of paper in front of me, and I put my head down on the table. The court-martial of Corporal Emmet Larke opened in the household court on the 2nd Tuesday of April, before 3 officers, with Princess Adela present as the Crown's observer, seated to the side in black, saying nothing. They had done everything right. That is what I want the world to understand about how these things happen. The evidence against him was excellent. The candle boss was genuinely from the chapel, and it was genuinely in his locker, and it had genuinely gone missing from the site store, and he had genuinely had access to the store, and he had genuinely. This was made much of been unusually interested in objects from that chapel for the past 4 months, which anyone would agree was odd, and which the prosecuting officer described as an obsession. He was offered a defending officer. He declined and asked leave to defend himself, and it was granted because it always is, and because a corporal defending himself against a captain is generally a short afternoon. He did not deny that the boss was in his locker. He did not accuse anyone of putting it there. He said when they asked him, "I don't know how it came there, sir, and I can't prove I didn't put it there, and I would rather not waste the court's time guessing." The prosecuting officer sat down rather pleased. Then Larke said, "Sir, I would like to call evidence as to why a person might wish this charge to succeed." The president of the court was a colonel of the household cavalry named Ray, a leathery, unsmiling, deeply conventional man who I am certain had gone into that room expecting to convict him by 4 o'clock and be home for dinner. He said, "Relevance, Corporal." "Motive to fabricate, sir. It goes to the whole of it. If the court finds nobody had reason to put that boss in my locker, then I put it there myself, and the court should convict me and I'll take my 7 years. But if somebody did have reason, the court had better hear what the reason was." Ray looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked, very briefly, at Princess Adela, who did not move and did not look back, and whose presence in that room was the loudest silent thing I have ever sat next to. "Call your evidence," said Colonel Ray. And Corporal Emmet Larke, who had been correct for 4 months, who had crossed 9 things off a list at a coal gate on a moor and had 11 left, and who had been arrested before he could do any of them, called his evidence. He called Barnaby Quill, verger, 81, deaf in the left ear, who came into that court in his good coat with his hat in his burned hand, and was so frightened he could not sit down, and who identified the tin box, and who told the court, in a voice far too loud, about the man who came in plain clothes 11 days after the fire and read the letters inside the watch case and told him to forget it, and who, when the prosecuting officer suggested to him gently that he was an old man misremembering, said, "I am an old man, sir, and I remember it every night, and if you had lost your hearing in that fire, you would remember it too." He called Guardsman Osric Penn, of 2nd Company, who had been told by 3 separate people not to come, and who had come, and who walked into that courtroom carrying in both hands a battered black book from the bottom of the orderly room press. The officer of the guard's counterfoil return book, Chapel Yard Gate, 2nd Company, 7 years old. The prosecuting officer objected at once, on the ground that the document was not in the possession of the accused and had not been produced on any regular demand, and he was entirely right, and it would have been excluded. And Sergeant Major Corps Bellamy stood up at the back of the court, in his own time, without being called, and said, "Sir, the book was produced on my written demand, on my authority as senior warrant officer of 2nd Company, at 10:00 this morning. The demand is minuted in the orderly room log. It is a company document. It has never left the company. And I hold, sir, that no man in this court can tell me I may not read my own company's books." Colonel Ray took the objection, and heard argument for 11 minutes, and admitted the book. It was opened at page 63 on the night of the 14th. And in the officer of the guard's return for the middle watch, in the carbon counterfoil, black on gray, was the entry that had been cut out of the King's Own Gate book 7 years before, and copied badly, and glued back with the wrong ink. 1.4 admitted at Chapel Yard Gate, 1 closed motor car, Chancellor's household, 3 persons, no business stated, Adam on production of household pass. 2.55 same motor car out, 2 persons, countersigned at the gate by SGTR Pike, City Watch attending on the household. 2 persons out. 3 in, 2 out, and 45 minutes later the Ashgrove Chapel was burning, and a third man was still inside the precinct. And the sergeant of the watch who had put his own name to that gate was, 11 days later, in a room on Lantern Row, holding down a piece of paper while a glazier who could not write made a cross on it. They called Rolf Pike on the Thursday, and he came in his chief constable's blue with his cap under his arm, and he was very good. He was better than good. He agreed with everything that could not be denied and remembered nothing that could. Yes, he had attended on the Chancellor's household that winter. It had been his duty. Yes, that might well be his countersign. He had countersigned 1,000 gates. No, he had no memory of a motor car at 10 to 3 in the morning. Did the court remember what it had done 7 years ago at 10 to 3 in the morning? The court plainly did not, and one of the members almost smiled. He was asked about the confession, and he said Tobin Ferrow had signed it freely, and that he stood by it, and that it was a hard thing for an old policeman to sit and be called a liar by a corporal with a grievance. Larke let him finish. Then Larke said, "Chief Constable, do you say the accused man wrote his own name?" "I say he signed it." "Those are different answers, sir." "They are the same answer." "Then let me ask it a third way," Larke said, and he did not raise his voice, and I have never in my life heard a room go so still. On the 11th day in the watch house on Lantern Row, did Tobin Ferrow make a mark? And Rolf Pike, who had spent 7 years perfectly safe, because the draft was gone, because the note was gone, because the verger was old and the gate leaf was cut, and there was nothing anywhere in the world to put against his word, looked at the corporal and said, with the ease of a man stepping over a puddle he has stepped over 1,000 times. He did not. He wrote his name in a good round hand, and he took his time over it, and I watched him do it. Larke turned to me. I stood up with a dry sheet of 200-year-old waste paper in a glass frame, and the Registrar of the Court of Assize said, "Sir, I produce Exhibit D9, the taking officer's own draft, recovered from the bindery board of the day book of the spring quarter, together with D9A, his note as to the manner of the mark, signed R. Pike, Sergeant." I have thought many times about the next 4 seconds. Pike did not shout. He did not deny it. He looked at the frame in my hands from 12 feet away, and his face did not so much change as stop. The whole busy, competent, reasonable machinery of it simply ceased, and what was underneath was not a monster. It was a tired man of 60 who had known, every day for 7 years, exactly what he had done, and had arranged his life so that he never had to look at it, and who had just been handed the one piece of paper he had been certain no longer existed. He said that was pulped. 2 words too many. He never spoke another useful sentence in his life. The doors of the court opened, and the Lord Chancellor came in. Lord Sabian Thorne was 71, and he wore no robe, and he did not need one. He apologized to the court for the intrusion with immense courtesy. He said that a most serious matter had come to his attention, that a military tribunal, sitting to try a simple charge of theft, had permitted itself to become the vehicle of an attack upon the administration of justice itself, on the evidence of an aged and injured witness, a document of doubtful provenance recovered from a bookbinder's rubbish and a soldier under charge with every reason to invent. He said that the courts of this realm had a settled and lawful procedure for the reopening of concluded convictions, and that he would ensure the matter took its proper course through that procedure, and he asked the court, as a matter of law, to confine itself to the question of the candle boss. He was entirely right about the law. He had drafted most of it, and he was, I think, 40 seconds from carrying it. Colonel Ray was already reaching for his pen when Princess Adela stood up. "Colonel," she said, "adjourn." The king sat 6 days later in the council chamber, under his own warrant, in a sitting of the crown in council, which had not been convened in the memory of any one living, and which no Lord Chancellor could adjourn, because it is the one court in Eldermore that the Lord Chancellor does not run. I was there because I was a witness. Larke was there under escort, still charged, still in the plain tunic they give a man whose regimentals have been taken from him, standing at attention for 4 hours with his hands behind his back. Lord Sabian Thorne was there, because he had the right to be. And beside him on the second bench sat his son. I had never seen Gaverick Thorne. I had expected, I don't know what I had expected, a hard face, a cruel one. What sat there was a man of 35 with gray already at the temple and hands that would not be still, who had not looked up once since he entered the room, and who looked, more than anything else in the world, like a man who has been waiting a very long time for a knock at the door. Crown Prince Rowan gave evidence on the second morning. Nobody had asked him to. He had asked to be heard, and the king had granted it, and he came in and took the oath and stood there, 33 years old, the heir to the realm, and said, "On the night of the 14th I was 19 years old, and I was at the midwinter revel at the Chancellor's house, and I left it at about 1 in the morning to walk back to my apartments, because I had had enough of it. I walked through the Ashgrove garden. As I came to the top of the garden, a motor car passed me on the carriage road, going down towards the chapel, and there were 3 men in it, and they were laughing, and one of them called out to me, and I did not stop, because I did not want to be drawn back into the evening. I thought nothing of it. I have thought nothing of it for 7 years." He stopped. It cost him something to go on, and everyone in that chamber saw it cost him something. I did not know a man had been tried for that fire. I was 19, and it was not put in front of me, and I did not ask, and there is no defense in that, and I do not offer one. But I was told 4 days ago that a glazier who made my mother's window has been in Stonefell for 7 years for burning it, and that a corporal of my father's guard has been broken for saying so. He turned to the king. "Sir, I saw that car. I will say so on my oath in any court in the realm, and I will say it in the street if I must." Lord Sabian Thorne rose and said that His Royal Highness's recollection, honorable as it was, could not identify the occupants of a motor car in the dark at 19 years of age and 7 years' distance. "No," said Rowan, "it cannot." And he sat down. And King Alaric said, "Then bring me the man who can." They brought Tobin Ferrow up from Stonefell in the afternoon, and I will not describe him at any length, because he would not have wanted it, and because the thing that was done to him is not a spectacle for anyone. He came in without shackles, by the king's express order, escorted by 2 warders who had been told to walk behind him and not beside him. He was 33, and he looked older, and he moved like a man who has learned to take up as little room as possible. He stood in the middle of that great gilded chamber under the eyes of the whole council, and he looked for a very long time at nothing at all, and then he found in the second rank of the standing witnesses a plain-tunicked soldier at attention with gray eyes, and he stopped looking anywhere else. He did not know him. He could not have known him. A man does not remember one escort out of a wagon he rode in 7 years ago. But he looked at him anyway, for the whole of what followed, the way a man in deep water looks at one fixed point on the shore. The king said, "Mr. Ferrow, do you know why you are here?" "No, sir, your majesty." Sir, he had been in Stonefell for 7 years. Nobody had told him anything, because nobody in Stonefell tells anybody anything. He had been taken out of a stone yard at 6 in the morning and put in a van, and he had been quite certain, he said afterwards, that it was to do with his mother's grave. The king said, "You were convicted on a confession. Did you sign it?" And Tobin Ferrow said, "I put my cross, sir. They read it to me. I couldn't tell you what was in it now." "Can you write your name?" "No, sir." The king said, "Give him a pen." And they carried a small table into the middle of the council chamber of the kingdom of Eldermore, and set a sheet of paper on it, and gave a pen to a glazier from Cutter's Lane, and asked him to write his name. He held it the way a man holds a chisel. He looked at the paper for a while. Then he set the nib down and made, very carefully, with enormous concentration, taking his time over it, exactly what he had made in the watch house on Lantern Row on the 11th day, and on a vestry delivery note on the evening of the fire, and on every paper he had ever touched in his life. A gross. The clerk carried it up and laid it beside the fair copy of the confession, with its looping, confident, flourished signature, and the two sheets were held up together in front of the king and the council and the crown prince and the princess and the Lord Chancellor of the realm. And nobody in that chamber said anything at all, for what I am told was 11 seconds and what felt to me like the better part of my life. Then Gaverick Thorne stood up. His father put a hand on his arm. I saw it. Everyone saw it. And Gaverick Thorne looked down at his father's hand, and then he took it off his arm, quite gently, the way you would move a sleeping animal, and set it back on the bench. "Your Majesty," he said, "I was the third man." He spoke for 40 minutes, and he did not spare himself once. 3 of them, after the revel at 1 in the morning, drunk in the way that only very young and very rich men are drunk, and a dare about the chapel silver, and a household pass, and a gate. He said they had not gone to burn anything. He said that was true, and that it changed nothing. He said the salver was heavier than they thought, and they had knocked over the oil, the barrel of lamp oil, delivered that evening, standing in the vestry where an honest man had left it, and one of them had had a lamp, and it went across the floor faster than a man can run. He said the other 2 got out. He said he did not, at first, because he could not make himself leave the window, that he stood in the south aisle while it started to go and watched the 7 panels of ordinary people doing ordinary work begin to run, and that he has not been able to look at colored glass since. He said he had climbed the precinct wall at 3:30. He said his father had known by 6 in the morning, and that he had never in his life had to ask his father for anything, that the machine of it simply began to move around him, and that Sergeant Pike had come to the house, and that after that he had not been told anything, and had not asked, and that not asking had been the whole of his life for 7 years. And he said at the end, with his father sitting 6 feet away, "I read in the newspaper that they had a man for it. I read his name. I have paid his mother's rent for 5 years, and I have never once been to her door, and I want the council to understand that I did that so that I could go on not asking, and that it was not decency. It was the asterisk opposite of decency. It was the price I paid myself to keep quiet, and I would have gone on paying it until I died." He turned around then in that gilded room, and found Tobin Ferrow, and he said, "I have no right to speak to you. I did 7 years of nothing while you did 7 years of Stonefell. I am not sorry the way a man is sorry. I am something there isn't a word for." And Tobin Ferrow, who had lost his window, his master, his trade, his mother, and 7 years of his one life, looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You've said it now." That is all he said. I have thought about it every day since. King Alaric gave his judgment standing, which he did not have to do. He quashed the conviction. He did not pardon. Larke had been immovable on that with everyone who would listen, and the princess had carried it to her brother. A pardon forgives a guilty man, and Tobin Ferrow had nothing to be forgiven for. The king made a writ of innocence, which had not issued in 90 years, declaring the conviction a nullity from the first day, and he ordered it read aloud at the assize, and posted at the gate of Stonefell, and printed in the Gazette on the front page and not the back. He ordered restitution to Tobin Ferrow out of the Crown's own purse, and a pension, and a workshop. He directed that Rolfe Pike and Gaverick Thorne be delivered to the ordinary courts, and tried like any other men in public, before a judge who had never sat under the Chancellor, and they were convicted, and they went where such men go, and I have no more to say about them. He accepted the resignation of Lord Sabian Thorne within the hour, and then, because a resignation is a courtesy and not a punishment, he stripped him of the seals and the offices and the stipends of 40 years, and he had him removed from the roll of the council with his own hand, in the book, in front of everybody. And he ordered, this is the part I still cannot read without stopping, a review of every criminal conviction in the realm secured upon a confession signed by a mark, going back 15 years, 640 of them. He made it a standing office of the Crown, and he required it to report to him personally each quarter, and he appointed as its registrar the registrar of the Court of Assize, who had once carried 2 pieces of paper up a flight of steps and put them down. I have been at that work for 4 years now. We have freed 19 men and 2 women. It is not enough. It is the only thing I have ever done that I would do again. And then the king turned to a corporal standing at attention in a plain tunic. The charge of theft was withdrawn on the spot, and the provost's officer who had brought it stood up and said so, and turned white saying it. King Alaric asked Corporal Emmet Larke what he wished for himself. The room waited. There was not a man in it who did not expect him to ask for a commission. "Sir," said Larke, "the gate books of the household guard were cut. That was done to my regiment, not to me. I would like leave to put them back in order." The king looked at him for a while. "You may have that," he said, "and you will take the sergeant's stripes you were kept from, and you will take them today, because I am not going to spend the rest of my reign explaining to my sister why I did not." The Ashgrove Chapel was rededicated in the autumn of the following year. The south window is there again. 7 panels, ordinary people doing ordinary work, no angels and no crowns, because the late queen had asked for none. It was made in a glazier's yard on Cutter's Lane, in a workshop granted by the Crown, by a man of 34 with gray in his hair and a slow way of standing, who took 11 months over it and would not be hurried, and who employed as his first apprentice a boy from the almshouse charity, and as his first hand, a young man just out of Stonefell on the Review, who had also signed a confession he could not read. In the lowest corner of the 7th panel, in a small square of clear glass where the leading turns, Tobin Ferrow said his name. He said across. The works office wrote to ask whether it was an error and whether it should be corrected before the ceremony, and the king's office wrote back 4 words, "Leave it. It is his." I went to the rededication. Barnaby Quill went in his good coat and sat in the front and heard perhaps half of it and cried through all of it. Princess Adela unveiled the window. The crown prince stood at the back where he had asked to stand. And at the chapel gate, the low iron gate of the chapel yard, the one with the book, there was a sergeant of the king's household guard on post, immaculate, motionless, eyes forward, rifle at his shoulder, the way he had been on a night watch 2 winters before when the restorers took down the vestry paneling and left a tin box sitting in the dark. Tobin Ferrow came out last, after the crowd had gone. He stopped in front of the sentry. He did not say anything. Sergeant Larke did not move and did not speak and could not, because he was on post and a man on post does not. They stood there like that, the 2 of them, for perhaps 10 seconds. The man who had been buried and the man who had gone in after him, on a wet cobbled yard, under a window that should never have burned. Then Ferrow nodded once and went away up the path. At 6 o'clock the guard was changed. The new sentry took the post. Emmet Larke marched off, halted, was dismissed, and then, in his own time, on his own liberty, he walked back down the path in the dusk to the glazier's cart standing at the end of the lane, and he put out his hand. And Tobin Ferrow shook it, and held on to it a long time, and neither of them ever told anybody what was said, and I did not ask. But I know what the guardsman said to me once, on a moor in the sleet. At a coal gate nobody wanted to pass, when I told him they could keep him there until he was 40 and it would work. He said, "It's a strange thing about standing still, ma'am. Everybody thinks it means you've stopped."